They called her the Iron Prosecutor, fearless, untouchable, and loyal to justice. But when a mysterious $25,000 check linked her to Donald Trump, everything changed. Accusations, investigations, betrayal. And then, just when the world thought her career was over, she walked back into the spotlight in the most shocking way imaginable. What made Pam Bondi defend the very man who nearly destroyed her reputation? The truth behind that decision will leave you stunned. They said she was too tough, too confident, too ambitious. But Pam Bondi never flinched. Those were the whispers in the courtroom halls, in the back offices of Florida's political machine, and even among criminals who knew better than to underestimate her. From the moment she stepped into the world of law, Pam Bondi had one rule: don't blink first. She was born and raised in Tampa, Florida, the kind of place where people knew your father's name, and your reputation traveled faster than your car ever could. Her father, a city councilman and former mayor of Temple Terrace, taught her early that truth didn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it hid behind it. She listened, and she remembered. Bondi didn't enter law school with a dream of fame. She entered with a fire, one that would burn through the courtroom for years. She began her career as a prosecutor in Hillsborough County, and quickly developed a reputation that made even hardened criminals second-guess their confidence. She took down violent offenders, drug cartels, corrupt politicians, and predators who had long escaped justice. And she did it not with rage, but with precision. She was polite but fierce, calm but calculated, a smiling storm in a tailored suit. Colleagues described her as a woman who never missed a detail and never broke under pressure. She didn't just walk into court, she walked in like she owned the room. Not because she wanted power, but because she had earned the right to use it. By the time she became Florida's Attorney General in 2011, she wasn't just a rising star, she was a political force. And she wasn't interested in easy cases. She took on pill mills and human trafficking rings. She stood firm against online predators. She was at the front of multi-state lawsuits against Big Pharma, fighting the very companies that had created an opioid epidemic ravaging her state. She spoke on national news shows. She testified before Congress. And she did something most politicians are afraid to do. She picked fights with people more powerful than her. But as every strong figure eventually learns, the higher you rise, the more people wait for your fall. It started with a phone call, a moment, a check. In 2013, the name Trump University began circulating through legal channels. Dozens of states were investigating claims that it was a fraudulent education company, promising real estate secrets, but delivering empty seminars and deep debt. Pam Bondi's office began reviewing complaints. And just as quickly as the investigation began, a donation appeared, $25,000, from a foundation tied to Donald J. Trump, to Pam Bondi's re-election campaign. Within weeks, Florida's investigation into Trump University quietly disappeared. Coincidence? Or corruption? That was the question every journalist in the country wanted answered. News outlets exploded with theories. Was it a payoff? A political favor? A clerical accident? Bondi denied any wrongdoing. She said she never discussed the case with Trump and that the donation had nothing to do with it. But the damage was already done. Suddenly, the fearless prosecutor who once terrified the corrupt was now being accused of corruption herself. Critics demanded investigations. Ethics committees got involved. Newspapers ran front-page exposés. And through it all, Pam stood firm, just like she always had. "I'm not for sale," she told the press. "I've fought harder battles, and I won't be bullied now." But the whisper campaign had already begun. Her name became late-night talk show material. Cartoons portrayed her as a puppet. Activist groups flooded her office with phone calls. She wasn't just a lawyer anymore. She was a target. And in the court of public opinion, sometimes the truth doesn't matter, the story does. But Pam Bondi wasn't about to run. She turned toward the fire. Years later, she would reappear on the national stage, not as the accused, but as a defender. In 2020, she joined President Trump's impeachment defense team, standing in front of the Senate with the same poise that once held Florida courtrooms silent. The woman who once refused to flinch didn't now either. Some saw it as loyalty. Others saw it as political calculation. But to Pam, it was simple. The Constitution doesn't care about your party, she said. It cares about fairness, about law, and that's what I'm here to defend. Today, Pam Bondi remains a polarizing figure. To some, she is a hero, a fearless voice for justice who stood up when others backed down. To others, she is a reminder of how power and politics often blur the lines of integrity. But beyond the headlines, beyond the controversy, there's still a woman from Tampa who believes justice is worth fighting for, even when it's fighting back. And if you're wondering whether she regrets anything, ask yourself this. Would the hunter still take the shot if she became the hunted? If you know Pam Bondi, you already know the answer. In 2016, something shifted. The name Pam Bondi, once associated with courtroom victories and bold prosecutions, suddenly appeared in headlines of a very different kind. Not for a high-profile criminal case, not for a tough legal win, but for a check, a name, a silence, and a growing question no one seemed able to answer. It began quietly, the way most political tremors do. Backroom conversations, legal whispers, a few red flags buried in paperwork. But then, one headline changed everything. Trump Foundation gave $25,000 to Pam Bondi during Trump University investigation. That sentence alone was enough to make the public pause. But the real story was much deeper. At the time, Pam Bondi was Florida's Attorney General, one of the most recognized state prosecutors in the country. Her reputation? Tough, relentless, unbending in the face of power. So when she began reviewing complaints about Trump University, a real estate education program run by then businessman Donald Trump, many assumed she'd treat it like any other investigation. And the complaints weren't small. Across several states, former students claimed they were misled, overcharged, and deceived, some losing tens of thousands of dollars chasing the promise of Trump-branded success. New York had already filed suit. Other states were preparing their cases. And Florida? It was on the edge, leaning toward joining the fight. Then something curious happened. In the middle of this decision-making process, a donation appeared. $25,000. From the Donald J. Trump Foundation, a charitable organization. The recipient? Pam Bondi's re-election campaign. The timing was tight. Too tight. Almost immediately after the check was processed, Florida quietly backed away from the Trump University investigation. No lawsuit. No press release. Just silence. And in that silence, the media pounced. Major outlets across the country began connecting dots. The Washington Post, CNN, the New York Times, all asking the same question. Was this donation a thank you gift, or a bribe in disguise? Ethics watchdogs raised alarms. Political commentators tore into the story. And social media lit up with fury. Some called it pay-to-play. Others said it was just politics as usual. But nobody could deny the optics. A $25,000 check from Trump's charity, followed by Bondi's decision not to investigate him. Pam Bondi responded, quickly and sharply. In a press statement, she insisted she never spoke to Trump about the donation or about the Trump University case. The check, she claimed, had nothing to do with her official duties. It was simply a donation error, paperwork confusion, nothing more. And when asked why Florida dropped the case, her office pointed to a lack of strong evidence at the time. But public trust doesn't rely solely on legal explanations. It runs on perception. And this one, it didn't look good. The storm didn't stop. Watchdog groups filed official ethics complaints. The IRS began asking questions. Even the Trump Foundation later admitted the donation violated tax laws. Not because of intent, they claimed, but because charitable organizations aren't allowed to donate to political campaigns. The $25,000 mistake, as it was called, led to a penalty for the Trump Foundation, but no charges for Bondi. Still, the damage was done. In the court of public opinion, Pam Bondi, once the fearless prosecutor who chased justice at all costs, was suddenly being seen as someone who might have let justice be bought. Inside her office, the pressure was building. Staffers were getting flooded with calls. Protesters stood outside her events. National television hosts speculated about her every move. Some called for her resignation. Others defended her, saying she was being targeted for political reasons. But no one could ignore the question that hung over her like a storm cloud. Did she pull back to protect the public? Or to protect a billionaire friend? Bondi kept speaking. She faced cameras. She stood by her decisions. But behind the confidence, the controversy had left a crack, not just in her career, but in the image of a woman who had always stood above suspicion. Because in politics, it's not just about what you do. It's about how it looks when you do it. As time passed, the scandal faded from headlines, replaced by newer controversies, louder voices, and a fast-moving political landscape. But for Pam Bondi, the $25,000 donation would never fully disappear. It became a footnote in every future article, a shadow behind her every appearance. And when she later returned to the spotlight during Trump's impeachment trial, the echoes of 2016 were still there. Some saw her as a loyal legal warrior. Others saw a politician who had been bought and brought back. But the truth? It's buried somewhere in the middle, tangled between legal technicalities, political timing, and public suspicion. And maybe that's what makes this story unforgettable. Because sometimes, in the world of justice and power, the question isn't what happened. It's who was watching when it did. Critics pounced. Not gradually. Not gently. They swarmed. Within hours of the Trump Foundation donation being exposed, newsrooms across the country lit up like a wildfire. The headlines weren't careful. The tone wasn't subtle. Pam Bondi, Florida's hard-nosed attorney general, was no longer being celebrated for taking down opioid traffickers or exposing fraud. She was now the focus of suspicion, the center of a political storm. National anchors dissected every detail of the timeline. Donation received, case dropped, public silence. Legal experts debated the ethics on morning shows. And late-night comedians turned her into a punchline. With sketches and sarcastic applause, they painted her not as a tough prosecutor, but as a political pawn. Even the Washington Post published a piercing article. Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi's Trump problem. Those 5 words became a headline and a hammer. Within 72 hours, her name was trending, not in celebration but in scrutiny. Across Florida and across the country, people asked the same question. Did she take the money and walk away? Suddenly, every past case she touched was revisited with new eyes. Every donor to her campaign was re-examined. And every photo of her and Trump, even ones taken before the controversy, circulated online with captions implying betrayal, dishonesty, and deals made in shadows. It didn't matter if the evidence was circumstantial. In the court of public opinion, suspicion had already rendered its verdict. Pam Bondi, once the hunter of the corrupt, now stood accused by implication, her reputation starting to show cracks under the weight of a growing scandal. But then something happened, something that surprised even her harshest critics. She didn't hide. She didn't release a carefully worded statement and disappear behind closed doors. She didn't cancel press briefings. She didn't shift the blame to staff or make vague denials. Instead, she walked straight into the fire. Pam Bondi doubled down. With lights glaring and microphones packed inches from her face, she addressed the media with the same composure she once brought into courtrooms full of felons. "I am not for sale," she declared, her voice unwavering. "I've taken on drug cartels. I've prosecuted corrupt officials. I've fought for the people of Florida when no one else would. You think I'm going to crumble now? Because of a $25,000 donation I didn't even personally solicit? No. I stand by what I've done, and more importantly, why I've done it." She didn't read from notes. She didn't apologize for optics. She owned the moment. In that single press conference, she flipped the script, at least for some. Supporters praised her courage. They said it was exactly what made her different. She didn't run, and she didn't fold. "She's a fighter," one voter said on live TV. "She's been under fire before. This is just another ambush." But for critics, it wasn't enough. They pointed to the timing, the tax law violations by the Trump Foundation, the lack of transparency around why Florida chose not to pursue the Trump University case. They didn't care that she was speaking. They wanted action. They wanted consequences. And so the pressure didn't ease. Ethics complaints flooded in. Watchdog groups demanded investigations. Social media turned her name into a lightning rod. Hashtag Bondigate. Hashtag Bought or Brave. Hashtag 25K-Truth. Twitter threads exploded with accusations. Facebook posts claimed her career was over. Political bloggers wrote think pieces titled, The fall of Florida's iron prosecutor. But Bondi? She stayed in position. She continued going to work. She kept speaking to the press. She refused to flinch. In private, according to aides later interviewed, the walls were closing in. Threats were pouring in. Family members were being followed by reporters. Anonymous emails arrived daily, accusing her of betrayal, some so intense, security had to be increased. And still she didn't bend. To those who knew her best, it wasn't shocking. This was Pam Bondi, the same woman who once prosecuted a sex trafficking ring while being targeted by one of its kingpins. The same woman who walked into a courtroom alone when others were too scared to appear. This wasn't her first fight, a former colleague said, but it might have been the first time she was the one being hunted. And yet, even as investigations opened and closed, even as federal officials scrutinized the donation and the Trump Foundation admitted to violating tax laws, no charges ever touched Bondi. Some said it was because there was nothing illegal. Others believed it was because she was protected. But either way, the line had been drawn. Supporters saw her as a woman wrongly accused, a tough leader targeted for being effective. Critics saw her as someone who used justice as a ladder and forgot who she stepped over on the way up. And then came the final twist, the one no one saw coming. Years later, as Donald Trump faced impeachment, guess who walked back into national spotlight? Pam Bondi, now standing at his side, not as a prosecutor, but as a defender. To many, it confirmed their worst fears. To others, it was proof of her loyalty and conviction. But to everyone watching, one thing was clear. Pam Bondi wasn't just back in the headlines. She was back in the arena. The woman once accused of bowing to power was now choosing to face the most powerful storm in American politics head-on. And that's when the story stopped being about donations and started being about something more. Conviction, loyalty, and the cost of standing your ground, even when the world is against you. Years passed. The headlines faded. The noise of the controversy dulled into whispers. But Pam Bondi? She wasn't done. After weathering one of the most brutal chapters of her political life, being publicly scrutinized, investigated, and questioned over a donation from Donald Trump's foundation, most people assumed she would take the quiet road. A consulting job, maybe. A private practice. Or simply stepping out of the limelight. But Pam Bondi never did what was expected. It was 2020, the year that changed everything. The nation was on edge. Divided. Furious. And obsessed with one name. Donald J. Trump. He was now the 45th President of the United States, and the country was watching as he became the third president in American history to face impeachment. The charges? Abuse of power. Obstruction of Congress. The setting? The United States Senate, with the world watching live. And then, like a plot twist in a courtroom drama, Pam Bondi walked back into the spotlight. Not as a commentator. Not as a critic. Not as a spectator. But as a key member of Trump's defense team. The reaction was instant. The same woman whose political reputation had been nearly destroyed over a Trump donation was now standing in his defense, helping to fight off impeachment charges that could end his presidency. Why would she do it? That was the question that exploded across every major media outlet. CNN anchors raised eyebrows. The New York Times ran op-eds. Social media turned her name into a trending firestorm again. Is this loyalty or leverage? Is she settling a score or proving a point? Some critics painted it as the ultimate betrayal of impartial justice. Others said it was redemption, a chance for Bondi to reclaim her legacy by standing firm for what she believed. But if you asked her, it was about one thing. The Constitution, she said. I've spent my life defending the law. And today, I'm here to make sure it's applied fairly, no matter who you are. Her opening arguments on the Senate floor were calculated, confident, and razor-sharp. She attacked the impeachment case on legal grounds. She questioned the motives of the House managers. And she did it all with the poise of a veteran prosecutor who knew exactly what kind of pressure she was under, and welcomed it. It wasn't just a legal defense. It was a performance, and Pam Bondi delivered it with precision. To her supporters, this was her comeback story. Proof that no scandal, no smear, no donation could keep a strong woman down. She had taken the hit, and now she was taking the podium. To them, she was more than a lawyer. She was a symbol of resilience. But to her critics, this was the final confirmation of every fear they'd voiced back in 2016. That she had been protecting Trump all along. That the $25,000 check wasn't just a fluke, it was the beginning of a political alliance. One critic on MSNBC said, "She was given the chance to prove she was independent, and instead, she stepped into the very fire she once claimed she didn't cause." And yet, Bondi didn't flinch. She had built her entire career on stepping into high-pressure cases. Whether it was busting human trafficking rings or dismantling opioid pill mills, she never ran from the hard battles. And she wasn't about to start now. In private, sources later revealed, Bondi was well aware of the storm her return would create. But she also knew the stakes. To her, this wasn't just about defending Trump. It was about defending the system. "You don't throw away due process just because you don't like the man in office," she told colleagues. "That's not justice. That's vengeance." It was a sharp line, and it cut through the noise. Inside the Senate chamber, she held her ground. Outside, her name was once again on every screen in America. Supporters flooded her with messages of admiration. Old allies resurfaced to praise her courage. And critics? They sharpened their knives. Some accused her of selling out for power. Others accused her of helping normalize corruption. The truth? Probably somewhere in the middle. But in politics, perception is everything. And Pam Bondi had never been afraid of being misunderstood, as long as she believed in her cause. In a world where most political figures backed down under pressure, Pam leaned in. She didn't ask to be liked. She asked to be heard. And whether people loved her or hated her, she got what she wanted. The whole world listened. In the end, Trump was acquitted by the Senate. The impeachment trial ended. And once again, Bondi walked out of the fire, not unscarred but unbroken. She didn't ask for applause. She didn't do interviews or victory tours. She did what she always did. She moved forward. Because that's who she was. A fighter. A lightning rod. And above all, a woman who refused to stay silent in the face of controversy. Pam Bondi's return wasn't just a political moment. It was a reminder that in America, redemption doesn't come quietly. It comes when the stakes are high, the cameras are rolling, and the world demands an answer. And for Bondi, that answer was simple. "I'm not here for politics. I'm here for the law." Today, Pam Bondi lives in a world that isn't black and white. Her name still stirs strong reactions. To some, it means strength. To others, scandal. Some see a fearless warrior for justice, a woman who went toe-to-toe with drug cartels, human traffickers, and political firestorms, and never blinked. They remember the prosecutor who put criminals behind bars when no one else dared. They remember her voice, strong, clear, unwavering, even when the cameras turned hostile. They say she stood for Florida, for families, for law and order. But not everyone agrees. To others, Pam Bondi is the face of political backscratching, of questionable donations, and power alliances that left too many questions unanswered. They don't see a fighter. They see a dealmaker. A woman who, in their view, chose ambition over ethics and loyalty over law. For them, the $25,000 Trump Foundation donation will always define her. Not because it proved corruption, but because it suggested it. And in politics, suggestion can be just as powerful as truth. But behind all of this, behind the sound bites, the angry tweets, and the front-page headlines, is a real person. A woman born and raised in Florida. A daughter, a friend, a former prosecutor who spent over a decade fighting for people who had no voice. Someone who's been celebrated one day and vilified the next. Pam Bondi knows what it means to be judged. Not just by courts, but by the court of public opinion, where trials never end and forgiveness is rare. Especially if you're a woman in power. Because the rules, whether we admit it or not, are different. A male politician makes a controversial decision. He's strategic. A woman in the same position, she's manipulative. Or worse, emotional. Bondi didn't just walk through fire, she did it under a microscope. Every outfit, every word, every connection. Parsed, twisted, weaponized. But through it all, she kept moving. She once said in an interview, "I don't need everyone to agree with me. I just need to sleep at night knowing I did what I believed was right." That quote didn't trend on Twitter. It didn't make the news cycle. But maybe it should have. Because that's where the real story lives, not in the courtroom victories, not in the controversy, but in the quiet choices she made when no one was watching. She could have quit. After the Trump donation backlash, she could have stepped down, disappeared into private law, and avoided the spotlight forever. After the impeachment trial, she could have refused to return, spared herself another round of public fire. But Pam Bondi doesn't quit. She shows up. Again. And again. And whether you agree with her decisions or not, that kind of resilience, especially in a political world that devours its own, is rare. Today, she lives somewhere in the gray, not a hero, not a villain. A symbol of how complicated public service really is. Of how people who fight for justice can still get caught in the machinery of politics. Of how truth, loyalty, and power don't always point in the same direction. Her legacy? It depends on who you ask. To a domestic violence survivor, she once helped protect through aggressive legal reform, she's a hero. To an activist who believes she turned a blind eye to Trump's wrongdoings, she's a cautionary tale. To a young law student reading about her cases, maybe she's both. And maybe that's what makes her story so human. Because real life isn't a clean-cut courtroom drama. It's messy, conflicted, personal. It's a prosecutor defending a president she once investigated. It's a woman standing strong while being accused of political betrayal. It's a public servant trying to do right and being torn apart for how that right is interpreted. Pam Bondi's life reminds us that the fight for truth doesn't come with applause. Sometimes it doesn't even come with clarity. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is to keep showing up, to keep speaking even when your voice shakes, to keep standing even when the world wants you to sit down. Because power, real power, isn't found in headlines or campaign wins. It's found in the nights you lie awake, wondering if you did the right thing, and deciding to try again the next day anyway. So whether you love her or hate her, whether you see a defender of justice or a symbol of corruption, Pam Bondi remains one thing above all: unapologetically present. She didn't write her story for applause. She didn't wait for permission. She took the stand, time and time again. And maybe that's the real takeaway. Because sometimes the strongest people in politics aren't the ones who win every battle. They're the ones who survive them. In a world where power often silences truth, Pam Bondi's story isn't just about politics. It's about resilience, perception, and the unforgiving cost of conviction. Whether she's remembered as a protector of justice or a pawn of power, one thing is certain: she never disappeared, never apologized, and never stopped fighting. And sometimes that's what separates a politician from a force.